I'm Georgia Holston. I'm a co-founder of RegTech Talks. I'm going to do a bit of a presentation first before handing over to our panel that we have today. So I'm just going to share my screen. And can my panelists give me a thumbs up that you can see my slides? Perfect. Thank you. So RegTech Talk, let's talk the future of sustainable regulation. 2 years ago, we launched RegTech Talks as part of Leeds Digital Festival. So we are very proud and happy to announce that we're still going strong and running events. And this is, I think, maybe our 10th or 11th event so far. And again, it is in partnership with Leeds Digital Festival. If you haven't seen any of the other events on the festival, take a look at the site. They're going on up until the end of this week. So there's lots of other great digital events to get involved with there. As for our event, we have two great panelists. We've got Terry, who's the co-founder at Buildstream. We've got Carl, who's the head of sales at MENA. I'm going to allow these guys to give themselves a bit more of an introduction when it comes to their talks straight after mine. So a bit of an introduction to RegTech Talks, why we launched it a couple of years ago. If anyone's new to the initiative, we're looking to spark conversations around emerging technology that's being developed to create operational efficiencies in heavily regulated sectors. So for me, we were at Holston Marketing, we were seeing a lot of companies that were heavily regulated and were doing things in a very archaic manner. We saw technology being introduced to create real efficiencies, not just to circumvent regulation, but to enhance the reason that regulation's there. So for us, compliance, it's integral to safeguarding the quality standards of those industries that are most integral to our society, culture and way of life. I think a lot of people think of RegTech in terms of just finance or fintech, or be the younger brother of fintech, but RegTech really does span the breadth of every regulated industry. I'm going to go into two really important and very heavily regulated industries with Terry and Carl straight after this. By running collaborative events for RegTech Talks, we're able to provide a conversation around opportunities on how tech has been implemented, not just to meet the compliance standards, but also do some good in the world. So, talking about good in the world, sustainability, why did we think that we would start talking about sustainability today? So obviously, it is a hot topic. It's a word on everyone's lips. We've got COP26 coming up next in November in Glasgow. It's going to be run by the UN, and their whole strapline around that is the fact that the climate has no borders. So it's all about working together in terms of sustainability. Also, sustainable regulation is on the rise, led by the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And if you're in business and you haven't seen these, you're probably not looking in the right place, but these are absolutely ubiquitous now, and they're bleeding into not just goals, not just aims, but actually into how a lot of industries are being regulated in terms of their carbon footprints and other sustainable elements of the way that they run their businesses. There's also lack of international frameworks. Now, obviously, the UN are obviously trying to come in and create something a little bit more unilateral when it comes to the way that we look at regulation in terms of sustainability. But there's a huge disparity. We can look at Europe and say, yeah, we're the trailblazers when it comes to creating a more sustainable future in terms of the companies that we have here. But when we look more at the developing world, it's a lot harder, and there's a lot more issues for them to deal with, and sustainability isn't always necessarily at the top of the agenda. We also have to talk about greenwashing. A lot of activities in terms of CSR reporting, or in terms of just PR, a lot of it is just sort of, it's sustainability activities, green stuff, ecological stuff, just for the sake of it. It's not necessarily always future-proofing initiatives, and they're not necessarily always innovative or making real changes. A lot of the work is offsetting as well when it comes to that greenwashing piece. You'll see companies going out, we've planted this many trees and that kind of thing, but actually the effects of those types of offsetting won't actually come into play for a very long time, and companies really need to, instead of trying to offset their carbon footprint, just actually reduce it through the way that they are sustainable in the way that they work as a company, as opposed to just saying, "Oh, we'll do all of this environmentally harmful things, but it's okay, we're going to offset it over here." You might not see the difference for many years. Competing priorities. So we need to talk about the fact that although sustainable regulation, it is becoming a little bit more widespread, particularly, as I say, in Europe, there are actually a lot of business priorities that are competing with the sustainability agenda. Durable mediums is a really interesting one, and this is specific to finance and to fintech as well. It's not just a competing priority within that industry, but it's also actually a competing regulation. So in Europe specifically, any changes to contracts, T's and C's, those types of things, they need to be sent to the consumer in what's described as a durable medium. So basically paper and something that's immutable. There are some great alternatives, and we actually ran an event in November of last year with our partners at Altave. Their solution involves a blockchain solution, and that allows for a single version of the truth, and that adheres to the durable medium piece of regulation. It also eradicates the need for paper documents to be sent out. So it means that firms are able to adhere to the sustainable regulations and the durable regulations at the same time. And that is a real, trailblazing example of how technology is being implemented to create those efficiencies with regulations that have been steadfast for many years, but actually compete against sustainability. CapEx is always going to be at the top of the list for any company. Obviously, there's a lot of government levies that have been put in to support companies who are looking at creating more sustainable operations. So whether that's EV charging, whether that's the installation of solar panels, right through to things like industrial IoT systems, real-time monitoring, management of energy, those types of things. Companies will ultimately see the ROI on any initial outlays for them upgrading their facilities, but when we look at industries such as retail or hospitality, where the profits are razor thin and they've been hit so bad from COVID, and that they're just starting to recover, it's sometimes quite difficult for them to justify any sort of major facilities upgrade and that initial outlay in terms of the capex there as well. Buy-in is always competing. You're always having to convince someone. This tends to be, we've seen a lot more with publicly traded companies, those who have to deal with stakeholders, board members, shareholders who potentially aren't necessarily there for the long run. So they want to see short-term returns and aren't going to be there for the long-term return on that initial outlay. So it's sometimes difficult to get board level buy-in on some real core sustainable changes to companies. There's also culture change. If anyone has ever worked in international internal comms, like we have, you'll know that culture change is a lot of the time trying to convince people to make habit changes, like pushing water up a hill a lot of the time. But so culture change is, and the communications around that is also a bit of a challenge when it comes to implementing sustainability. And then there's quality as well. Some firms are starting to have a concern that the things that they produce may not be of the same quality if they're using recycled materials, or if they're doing things in a different way, or they're trying to implement other sustainability actions. A great example is supermarkets. I don't know how anyone else feels, but I absolutely hate opening up my fridge after I've done the shopping and it's just absolutely full of plastic. Obviously for supermarkets, it's really important for them to have longer shelf life. Again, the retail margins are real thin for major retailers right now, but supermarkets are actually contributing 900,000 tonnes of plastic packaging to the market every single year, and fruit and veg represents 38 tonnes of that. There are charities like Greenpeace who know that actually the public don't want their stuff covered in plastic, and if the public do raise their voices, then that will change the way that companies work. Greenpeace have got their own Break Free from Plastic campaign, where they're having people from the public mention companies to say that they no longer want plastic packaging, and then you can see there's absolutely thousands of examples of people just saying, why is my one banana covered in plastic? It has its own packaging, it comes that way, it's fruit. So there's such a huge swell of change, such a massive sea change, and we know there's no point in sort of labouring the point around sustainability, but we do have to consider those industries like the ones that both of us, our speakers, are in today, and consider just safeguarding our way of life and the quality of the things that we do produce, that we put in our bodies, or that are integral to the way that we live, things like finance, law, that do have those quality levels that need to stay up there, but finding more sustainable ways of creating that quality control. So that's enough for me, enough of a justification as to why we're talking about sustainability. I'm sure everyone is in agreement that it's a topical conversation. I'm now going to hand that over to you, Terry, for your presentation. I'm going to just go on to mute. Are you able to share your screen?
Yep, just 1 second. So let me know when you can see my screen.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, that's perfect.
Right. Well, hello, everybody. I'm Terry Clark, the CEO and co-founder of Buildstream. Buildstream is a platform to help companies digitize the supply chain quality process. So we're a technology startup that's digitizing the way that companies source and manage supply chain audits and inspections. My background has always been in energy engineering and construction. I was most recently at Segro PLC, where we, in response to changing legislation around carbon and the environmental impact, we invested a ton of money building out a renewable energy portfolio and investing in energy efficient projects for our portfolio of property that spanned about £6 billion worth of value across Europe. So while I was working there, I was sourcing inspectors in all these different countries, and realized that there's a big gap in the way that we audit and inspect our supply chain to make sure that things are what they say they are. And that was the seed for the idea of Buildstream. So in these next few slides, I'm going to talk through why supplier quality is important. We're going to run through some case studies and then show some examples of how companies try and source these independent contractors in today's market, and then a couple of slides on how we tackle that within Buildstream. So first of all, supply chain quality matters because there's constant change in legislation and regulations in the global supply chain, and whenever there's changes, there can be a slip in standards. Now, some of the big changes that have happened over the last few years are Brexit. That's changed the way that we trade in the UK with other countries, and that can lead to slippage in standards. There's ever-changing regulations in food safety for carbon emissions. We've also had trade wars and tariffs. So, when the US changes the rules for trade, it means that supply chains need to realign. And whenever they're realigning, there's kind of a gap in trust and in quality that can affect things. Some other issues that affect the supply chain are child labour and forced labour. So there's a lot of work being done at the moment to make sure that companies aren't using forced labour. For example, the Uyghur situation over in China, that's a huge concern. All these issues are coming to the forefront now. And we also have COVID. So, the world's had to, invest a lot in testing and vaccination programs, and that's all affected the way that services and products move around the world. So managing quality properly can result in a significant reduction of of risk. So if you're a large company that has, or even a small company that relies on external suppliers, you have tons of risks that you need to manage. Overall quality of the services and products, safety, business continuity. What happens if your supply chain is not stable and you're not able to continue your normal business? There's reputational risk. If something goes wrong due to a supplier, it's likely that your customers will perceive it as your fault. Cost volatility, supply disruption, non-compliance fines, and then also safety incidents that can cause reputational damage. And managing supplier quality can actually improve business relationships. It can help reduce costs and risks in the supply chain. And the way that companies can go about this is to do supplier pre-qualification and audits. So, working with your suppliers to tell them the standards that you require, and then having procedures in place to test that and to help the supply chain to kind of improve their standards so that they can serve you effectively. We also do some work in worker management and insurance monitoring to make sure that people are being compliant. And then there's also analytics. So, pulling out data from the supply chain to see who are the most sustainable suppliers, which ones have the fewest issues, and which suppliers are always ready with the information that you need and perform well, helps people to choose the right supply chain partners and kind of reward the ones that perform well. And then there's compliance standards, and there's kind of a chain here. You have compliance standards from the end client within each country that you're operating. You also have specific industry standards, and then corporate policies, and these can all focus around lots of different topics, environmental and sustainability topics being some of the main ones that we help companies to focus on. So when supply chain quality goes wrong, it can result in some pretty catastrophic events. So the total cost of these product recalls, which were due to poor supply chain quality management, totaled over $50 billion. You might remember the exploding phones in 2016. I think that was Samsung. That cost about $5 billion to put right, and had a huge environmental cost of all these phones being effectively useless. We also, have, even on the kind of more fun end, peanut contamination. Peanut butter spread in the US in 2008 had to do a product recall, which ended up costing $1 billion. So without managing supply quality properly, all these products and services are kind of going to waste, and there's a huge amount of environmental damage caused, but also reputational damage and wasted money. So we're going to look into two specific case studies here that are really in the sweet spot of what we focus in on Buildstream. So you might remember the BP Gulf of Mexico oil spill. So this happened in 2010, and then again earlier this year there was a more minor instance of it, but still, a big amount of environmental and cost damage occurred. And this was due to supply chain quality issues in 8 key projects within this overall Gulf of Mexico project. Now, what happened there was they didn't have the right inspection and audit procedures in place. So small issues with material specifications, drilling procedures, etc., weren't picked up early enough. And if you imagine a project at this scale, they just compounded over time to eventually cause this huge environmental disaster. So this cost BP about $60 billion to put right, and the project cost, it had a huge environmental cost. Decades worth of environmental damage occurred because BP weren't properly managing their supply chain quality. And this actually led to a bit of a revolution in standards, particularly within BP themselves, but also across the oil and gas industry, to make supply chain quality monitoring far more of a hot topic. And then another one that is slightly different was the VW emissions scandal. So this was around the testing requirements and the way that VW were kind of gaming the system around categorization of their engine and emissions performance. Now, they had a systematic failure here in the way that they were testing and auditing their supply chain and the products that they were producing, and that led to $30 billion worth of financial loss and a huge amount of reputational damage to VW. I think there'll probably be some people on the call that were affected by that and had to send their vehicles back in for testing and recalibration. And it also cost a huge amount of environmental damage. As a brand, I think VW were kind of viewed as being responsible for damaging the environment there and doing that for financial gain. So this just shows that it's big stakes getting your supply chain quality management right. And if you get it wrong, even whether it's intentional or not, it can cause a huge amount of damage. As a result of this, there were big changes in legislation around CO2 emissions management in the automotive sector. And we class supply chain quality as coming under environment, sustainability, and governance. It often falls within governance, and this is a big space that's only going to get bigger. PwC recently announced that they're hiring 100,000 people in this sector over the next 5 years. So it just shows how much investment they're making in that, which will filter down to all the large and small companies that we work with day to day. Now, the way that companies will traditionally work with independent inspectors and auditors will be to try and source them through LinkedIn and jobs boards. Now, if you have a global supply chain, that can be really difficult. You might be based in the UK, but have a supplier over in Europe. But how do you know that the inspectors and auditors that you source in there are trustworthy if you don't have enough information about it? And then managing everything over emails and spreadsheets can be quite time consuming and risky. So we basically created a marketplace. It's kind of like an Uber for quality professionals. So a client will come onto our platform, they'll tell us what kind of audit and inspection they need, and then we'll match them with a verified inspection provider that's available on location, on demand, and everything's managed through the platform, from scheduling and documents sharing to making the payments and team communication. And the aim here really is to make it really, really simple to provide people with access to the best supply chain quality professionals so that they don't have to worry about it, and it can all be kind of taken care of with that white glove service. So that's a quick intro into what we do, and happy to take any questions as they come along.
Thanks so much for that, Terry. And it's just reminded me, on our first ever event for RegTech Talks, we did have one of our clients at the time, Your Special Delivery Service, who are headed out of Sweden, and those guys, they haul anything from human tissue, and emergency transplant organs, right through to pharmaceuticals and even things that need a lot of cold chain stuff, like right down to cryogenic, and also fine art, and then also things like explosives. So those guys were very, very specialist in what they had to what they're having to ship around the world. And it's something that you sort of picked up on there as well, is the fact that so many different regions have their own regulations. So when you're working in supply chain, you're not having to just deal with your own industry regulations. You're having to deal with whatever it is that you're shipping. You're having to deal with where you've taken it from, where you're putting it to. And there's so many different issues that you have to deal with on top of just what a normal company in one industry would have to deal with. Mm-hmm. So I've got some questions, but we'll come to that after we've gone through our next talk. If you want to just stop sharing, we'll pass that over to Carl. Carl is head of new business at MENA. I'll hand over to you, Carl. I'll let you share your screen.
Super. Thank you very much, Georgia. Okay, share this and press play. So if you can't see me on the screen, you can see me on the presentation as well. Just going to double up with these things. So hello everyone, thanks ever so much for having me on today. I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about sort of our business and how regulation has sort of informed what we do, and also helped to accelerate our growth. And also help to improve our products that we produce. So MENA was started by these three chaps in leafy Sheffield, and sort of our kind of vision, raison d'etre, is to make paying for EV charging radically simple. But really, you kind of need to rewind a little bit from MENA and go back into Ash's previous roles. He's our CEO, the chap on the left, serial entrepreneur and driver of all new ideas. You can never keep him in one place at one time, or indeed on one email or one phone call at one time. He's normally doing about 5 different things at once. So he's had various companies over the years, but his most recent one prior to Mina was a company called Split the Bills. And Split the Bills, as the name suggests, was a bill splitting platform for shared households. And he sort of came about with this solution to shared household problems sort of through another company of his, Fit Property. And essentially what they did was they paid for people's utilities on their behalf. So the shared household would all have an account with Split the Bills, and they would handle all of the utility payments and all of this sort of stuff. And so he'd built up relationships with energy industries over the last 10 years and worked out how to pay for things on people's behalf. And Mina kind of came about from a real world problem that he had. So Ash has always been absolutely passionate about the environment and sustainability. And he needed to put his some of his sales guys into company cars. So he didn't want to go out there and source a nice shiny new diesel car. He wanted to put them in electric cars. But the big problem that you have with electric cars for company vehicles is, how do you pay for the charging of those vehicles accurately? So the current government advisory rate is 4 pence per mile. If you compare that to advisory fuel rates of somewhere between 12 and 21 pence, I think they are at the moment, depending on the size of the engine. Obviously, it's cheaper for an electric vehicle, but there's no variance to any of that. So if you've got any electric vehicle, whether that's a Renault Zoe through to a Porsche Taycan or an electric van, you're being paid 4 pence AER. So it's kind of not really fit for purpose. So Ash kind of realized that because he'd had these relationships with his energy suppliers, and he could pay energy suppliers on behalf of other people, why couldn't he pay for the charging of his company cars direct to the energy suppliers? And thus Mina was born. So we were we kind of came about in 2019, and lots of forward-thinking companies were kind of really interested in what we were doing. So companies like Mighty, who have their Plan Zero, which will be to transition to sort of zero carbon by 2025, which is pretty ambitious. And they were moving all of their electric vehicles, all of their fleet, which is somewhere in the region of 7,500 vehicles, to electric vehicles by 2025. So they saw our solution and thought, wow, this is amazing, we need to get on board. And we got a lot of traction in that way. But what really made the difference to us was the announcement back in, I think it was 17th of November 2020, when the government came out and said there's going to be no new internal combustion engine vehicles after 2030. And that had a significant impact on the pace and also our ability to grow the business, because suddenly fleets had 2 lease cycles before they had to replace all of their new vehicles. So if anybody's not aware of how the fleet world works, then what the vast majority of fleets want to have is complete control over their vehicles, because those vehicles are being used for company purposes. They need to make sure they comply to certain standards. They meet all the environmental regulation that's in place around emissions, safety, etc. So the gold standard of company vehicles will be the company owns or leases the vehicles, manages the total ownership of them, and replaces them on a 4-year cycle. You then have another kind of tier down called the grey fleet, where companies don't own the vehicles, the individuals own the vehicles, but there's still a lot of compliance that has to go along with that grey fleet in there as well. So we have basically been able to accelerate our business and also inform our business model because of the legislation that was put in place around removing ICE vehicles by 2030. Sorry, ICE, internal combustion engines industry abbreviations, apologies. So essentially, there are 2 lease cycles for the vast majority of fleets nowadays. So they need to start replacing their either diesel or petrol fleet with electric vehicles. Now, the vast majority of fleets are now thinking about doing that process either this year or next year. It's also helped to accelerate the production of electric vehicles as well. And there's a huge amount. I mean, certainly company cars. There's a lot of company cars out there that you'll see on the road, and electric vehicles. But in commercial vans as well, it's really put the pressure on some of the major European suppliers, the likes of VW, as I think Terry mentioned earlier on, rolled up in the emissions scandal. This time trying to make amends and try to redirect the company in a more sustainable way, and pushing them to create better platforms, better electric vehicles. Another sort of really significant one that's helped us and has helped to make that transition to electric vehicles is the benefit in kind for electric company cars. So this came into place at the beginning of 2020. And that basically stated that company benefit in kind. So if you have a company car, you would normally have a benefit in kind, and that's depending on the size of the engine. So if you were in a nice sort of 2-3 litre BMW that would cost 50 grand, I think that it's something like a 20% benefit in kind that you would pay in tax. With electric vehicles, that is currently 0. It will be changing to 1% benefit in kind in 21-22, and then 2% the year afterwards. So the government brought in this legislation to say that actually we're going to reduce and incentivize people to move to electric cars within company car fleets. Now, about 60 to 65% of vehicles on the road today are actually fleet vehicles. They're not privately owned. The privately owned sector is big, but the fleet sector is far bigger. So this is having the knock-on effect of creating demand for electric vehicles, that's pushing it back onto suppliers. Also creating demand for us, because we need to be able, the companies need to be able to pay for the charging of their electric vehicles, which is where we come in. And then also finally for that secondary market for company cars, because once they've reached the end of their lease cycle, then they get released into the secondary market, and then you'll start to see second-hand electric vehicles coming onto the roads now. So kind of two really significant areas that really helped us and really informed our platform and helped us to sort of accelerate what we were planning on doing anyway, but gaining more customers and therefore revenue and all those good things that any business needs to survive. And the final one I just sort of want to mention in terms of what the government have been doing and regulations and sort of legislation that's out there is around the Office for Zero Emission Vehicles, and they have a grant currently out there at the moment, which is allowing gives you up to £350 towards the installation of a charge point on your home, and again, something else where fleets have gone, wow, this is great. We can be incentivized to put charge points on people's walls. Thus, it makes it easier for us to put electric vehicles on the road. And then how do we pay for them? This is where MENA steps in. So it's really helped to accelerate that transition into company car electric fleets and also commercial vehicle fleets as well. Now that's changing in March next year, and the incentive is going towards rental property as opposed to homeowners. So it's going to be interesting to see what knock-on effects that has next year in terms of business models and how charge points are installed then. But as it stands, it's really, we've seen quite a significant uptake of people. So if any of you are thinking of getting an electric vehicle, get it now and get that 350 quid for putting your home charger on your wall, because it'll be gone from March next year. Then the final thing I wanted to talk about, and this is sort of not necessarily related to sort of government regulation here, but sort of loosely is, but very topical. No fuel or nobody at the pumps. As we've been fully aware over the last couple of weeks, there's been a bit of a shortage of lorry drivers, and therefore there's been a supply chain failure when it's come to filling up the petrol pumps. And where we're finding this increasingly interesting is that people are suddenly looking again at the electric vehicle sector and going, wow, this is something I want to be part of. And those of us who are lucky enough to drive EVs at the moment have been sort of driving around with that smug look on our faces. And our fleet managers have been coming to us saying, it's great because it's keeping our fleets on the road, because there isn't that problem with trying to access the fuel at the pumps. They're not having to queue up. They charge at home. We pay through your platform, blah, blah, blah. It's all great. So I think it's a really significant kind of point, and how the government, I'm going to be interested to see how they incentivize people to move away further from diesel and petrol, and will we see tax coming on fossil fuels and prices at the pump again, to push people away from fossil fuels and more into electric vehicles. So hopefully that was sort of a kind of useful. If you want me to go into a little bit more about what MENA does, then fire some questions through. I think George is going to sort of corral those at the end. But yeah, hopefully that covered things for you. And that's me, and those are my details if you want them.
Thanks, Carl. That was great. And yeah, I just wanted to bring up that meme that I mentioned earlier on, where it said that the aim for having all electric vehicles on the roads was 2020, but that has been moved up now to next Thursday from the government. So yeah, great insight there, particularly to do with the amount that you could benefit from having a electric vehicle at the moment. And I wondered, Terry, I was going to actually trying to tie these two together, and I wondered if you knew anything about how sustainable it is in terms of the supply chain of EV parts, because I know that that's been a topic where people are saying, oh, it's so much more sustainable to have an electric vehicle, but then there has been sort of the counter argument of, well, actually it's not less sustainable to make EVs as it is traditional, because people are having to retool factories and all that kind of thing. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in that, but I think there is, there's a bit of a trade-off, isn't there? What you're offsetting the use of a fossil fuel in petrol and diesel against a more efficient source in electricity. But yeah, how far back do you go into the supply chain to figure out, well, how carbon intensive is it to build these new technologies? And I have a feeling that it's carbon positive to move forward, to not be using fossil fuels overall. But when I was working in renewables, we had a lot of that with wind turbines for a relatively short period. Some of the arguments were that it's really carbon intensive to build, to manufacture wind turbines, and also solar panels too. But those arguments seem to kind of fade away a little bit. And I wonder if it's, people kind of a bit of NIMBYism and people trying to, halt progress. So, personally, I would probably say that it's more sustainable in the long term to move to these new technologies.
Surely there's a long-term gain over that short-term production footprint. What I can't do is sorry, carry on.
I was going to say, George, I think there's an interesting thing here around sort of companies, and I think there's a responsibility coming on the electric vehicle producers here, where you're looking at, I mean, some of the arguments around the carbon intensity comes around the rare earth metals that are being used into the batteries, and it is a problem, of course. You need to make sure you're looking deep into the supply chain and making sure that's being sourced sustainably, and it can be. I mean, there's mines being planned down in Cornwall now, where they will be all UK legislation, UK regulation, so they will have to conform to some pretty stringent sort of safety and environmental laws there. But I think what's interesting is there's got to be that pressure put onto the producers of these things, like there is in a lot of sectors, about creating something that's circular and not producing a product that's a throwaway. Once a battery is produced and then it gets to the end of its life cycle, what do you do with that battery at the end of the life cycle? And there's lots of different options in there. We've been talked with a company who do some really fascinating things around buses. They've got huge batteries in these buses, and what they do is they lease the buses, and when they're degraded past a sort of useful period for the range that they're needed, the batteries are taken out and put into battery storage banks. Tesla do something similar in terms of recycling their batteries into the wall power, into their Tesla power walls. Yeah. And I think what I'm hoping will happen here is that this kind of gets joined up. So you put pressure on the companies that are I want to say, that greenwashing jump on the bandwagon a little bit, still producing lots of those, lovely internal combustion engines because it drives the profits, but also, look at all our nice shiny, remote control electric vehicles that come onto the football stands during the World Cup, so the Euros, what are they doing to make sure that circle is completed and the batteries at the end of their life are used for something else? Because everything else within that vehicle is the same, tires, metal, they can all be recycled and repurposed and reused. It's the rare earth metals that shouldn't be wasted and thrown away and recycled at the end of their lifespan.
Yeah, the circular economy piece is it's so integral to sustainable ways of working. And I wondered as well, for both of you, because obviously, Terry, you've got that background in renewables, and I wondered, I think that I see people who have electric vehicles, and the same is the case with businesses. And I also have another initiative, Sustainability Partnerships, where we talk about sustainable methods of bringing new products and processes in healthcare, particularly into the NHS. And I know that facilities managers, it seems to come hand in hand, the sustainable generation of energy seems to come hand in hand with things like EV charging. So if someone, from a personal point of view, where you're like, oh, I'm going to get an electric car, that means I'm going to have to get some solar panels. Or like even something as huge as a new hospital build, they're like, oh, we're going to have 4 electric ambulances, but we need to make sure that they're charged all the time. But we can't necessarily rely on the grid, particularly with the rolling brownouts that we've had recently. And so they're thinking we need to produce our own electric, and that kind of mentality seems to come hand in hand. Do you agree that's the case?
Yeah, I think what I saw from my time in the industrial property sector. So we were involved in renewables and also EV charging. And what happened was, the renewable technology was there for years before, but nobody really engaged with it until there were the feed-in tariffs and the financial incentives to do it. Yeah. So once that market was that incentive was created, a market kind of grew around it. But then what we saw in EV charging was particularly on commercial properties, so shopping centres, etc. They wanted EV chargers because more of their customers, it was blocking out certain customers that had an EV but couldn't charge it. So it was interesting in that one. It was more of a commercial driver. So I think there are lots of factors, but it's nice to see examples of those too. An artificial financial incentive in the feed-in tariffs by the government, but then a commercial incentive around EVs. I think wherever there's money, people will flock to that. So. Interested to see how things combine and work together.
Yeah, I completely agree there, Terry. I think there's a lot of these things, and they do go hand in hand. I think the solutions aren't just as as clear as I need an EV, so therefore I need solar panels. I think there's something to do. There's definitely something around. I think heating has certainly come more to the forefront. Again, recently with gas prices, and we talk to a lot of smart home providers, who want to sort of be able to offer or partner with our solution in there as well, and the likes of heat pumps and all of that kind of. I think it's more of a holistic approach that people are starting to think about. So if I'm getting at an EV, it's going to save me money. I might be able to get that cheap, agile tariff through Octopus, but could I also produce my own energy? I can drive for free. Wow, that sounds amazing. And I think it kind of starts to excite people a little bit in there that actually I don't have to be, and especially with the stuff that's happened recently, with gas pricing soaring and fuel pump dropping out. I think you're going to see that even further, and that's not really to do with regulation here, and that's market factors that are driving that. I think it's going to be really interesting to watch that space over the next sort of 3-4 years, and how quickly you start to see people going off grid almost and being able to do things a lot themselves.
Yeah, we work with a company that allows for an entire facility to go off grid with their Tesla battery storage on site. So it's unprecedented times. I know I used terminology right now, but really there's just crazy stuff happening. You just
great.
what's going to happen.
It's so exciting.
Terry, I wanted to learn a little bit more about your platform. I wondered how many inspectors do you have on the platform, and how many countries? And also, I wondered if you could give us a bit of an insight as to how tough it's maybe been for those guys over the last 18 months, and if there has been any innovations that have arisen, such as sort of remote inspections, and if they have been allowed under regulation for things like offshore oil rigs and that type.
Yeah. So we have about 1,000 inspectors in our network right now, and everybody's being verified. So they send us all their insurance documents and all the training certificates, and we check them, we interview them, and then they come into our network. We've done inspections in 14 countries, so mostly in the UK and then mostly Europe, but we've done South Korea and Japan, and then a few in America as well. So the kind of value proposition is that if you have a global supply chain, we can sort you out, we can fix you up with the right people.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of technology moving things along, so we've been doing this for about a year, and things have really moved on with remote inspections and audits. That's twofold. First of all, obviously a client can't send an internal employee to go and do the inspections that they might normally do, so that they have to use somebody that's either on site, like a third party, to do that, or they'll ask somebody to basically use a video and use WhatsApp video was the first thing that people were using. So I think it's interesting actually to see how people adapt around that. And then the other one is supplier audits. So really that's always been a desktop kind of thing. I would say that more remote audits have been done than remote inspections, but that's because you're working through a suite of documents, and you don't really need to be there in person. Perhaps you might need to be in the office, but it's not such deep work that you need to be there in person. You can definitely do that remotely. And the oil and gas sector as kind of, there's always, well, for years there's been the technology to do remote inspections, but it wasn't large, hugely adopted, and we think that there's been about a 9x growth in remote inspections. And these oil and gas projects are critical infrastructure, so that they can't be delayed, so they have to find a way around it, which I think is interesting, because when the world kind of slowed down in March 2020 and beyond, those critical infrastructure projects had to keep going, otherwise the country would you'd have even more problems piled on top with energy shortages and price increases. So I think the industry has adapted quite well actually, and I think they'll continue to use these new approaches.
Yeah, I mean that's just really great to hear. That's exactly what we're talking about with RegTech Talks. Seeing something as simple as WhatsApp video being allowed to be used instead of people having to travel to whether it's an energy production facility or right out to an offshore oil rig. The carbon footprint alone, and just being able to use WhatsApp video and that being allowed to be regulation is it just shows. And I think that with the vast majority of work, not necessarily things that are super important and integral like inspections and audits, but every single company is really cutting down on the carbon footprint for having to go and visit people in real life, and it just isn't justified anymore. For me, it's like getting a train down to London from Leeds. Is A, the price is extortionate, and B, it's not needed so much. As much as it is lovely to sit in the room with clients and actually see people, it is the new normal. And I hate to say it, it's the trope that it is, but it's actually great to see. And I think Terry, it's great to hear those numbers as well. And the fact that will just be ongoing now. It's not just like, we did this as a stopgap. People are now saying, well, if we could do it for 18 months, we're going to keep on doing it. And we're going to see that the carbon footprint reduction because of just the people not having to travel. So that's really great to hear. I wondered, Carl, is a really tough last question for yourself, just around the conversations that are happening around the pressure on the grid. In the UK, particularly with obviously the energy prices and issues that we've had recently, and if you can just give us a sort of light talk, overview on worries and concerns about pressure on the national grid in the UK and the amount of electricity we're going to have to use for all these cars by next week.
Yeah, I mean, it is a fairly significant concern, but I think it's certainly been looked at. So there's companies like UK Power that are sort of members of all the kind of the major sort of utility companies and power grids, power networks across the UK, and they're looking at that transition to net zero by 2035. And with all of their modelling, it's all around how do we reduce our reliance on external imports, the likes of gas from Russia, or whatever, coal from wherever we were, and all those sorts of things. I mean, nuclear certainly has to play a part of that, but the technology is increasing all the time, and our rollout of things like offshore wind, tidal, onshore wind as well to a degree, which is sort of becoming less toxic, less NIMBY, anti-NIMBY here. But then there's a lot of other stuff that opens up, and what we were talking about before, where that sort of reliant, or that ecosystem of solar panels, electric car, vehicle to grid, all of those kind of interesting technologies that are in their infancy right now. We're now the 29th of September 2021, and the world has changed in such a huge way within the last 18 months. So think of what it's going to be like in 2035. We've got there's a massive jump to go, and I think we haven't even started to realize the kind of the power that we all have. I mean, if you think of the grid across the entire of the UK, and every single home is connected, if you switch all of the electric vehicles, all of the vehicles to electric vehicles, you've got a walking power source, a driving power source all the way around there. You can access that power at times when you need to. So I think whilst there are problems, I think there are very intelligent people, far more intelligent than I am, who are looking at all of this stuff, and I'm pretty excited about what's going to happen, to be honest. And we talk to so many amazing companies that are doing remarkable things, with hydrogen and all this kind of stuff, that half of it is just not even seen in the press, and I think I feel quite privileged to be to understand small parts of what goes on out there in the network. But I think it's going to be an incredibly exciting time over the next 10-15 years, and I have absolute confidence that we'll get there, and we will be net zero by 2035, and we'll all have solar panels or wind turbines or vehicle to grid batteries and all this sort of exciting stuff. So it'll get there.
Yeah, and I think that it's change is always driven from the bottom. You think that it's from the top, but it's not. It's from general consensus, because politicians need to keep the general public happy, really, at the end of the day. So a general consensus changes, and the sort of other becomes the norm. The norm becomes the pressure, and the pressure becomes regulation in the end. And that's when we actually do see change, when policymakers actually start putting things into law. And sustainability elements they're just not going to go away. And there are going to be it's going to become so much more stringent, particularly for those huge PLCs who regularly are getting fines all over the place for from huge things, from deforestation through to just your VWs trying to pull the system a little bit. But yeah, so Terry, was there I wondered if you could give us a last comment on what you think maybe the future will be. We've got up to 2035 comments from Carl there, so I wondered if you could let us know what you think the future of a sustainable supply chain looks like, and how a platform like yours is going to really become the lifeblood of that, because the people that you work with, they're generally one-man bands, aren't they? They're sort of one off, and maybe two guys, and those small companies really are the lifeblood of our cultures, and I wondered if you could just give us some final thoughts on that. I thought that was many different things. Sorry, so whatever you think is relevant with that ramble.
Yeah, no, I think sustainable. So I kind of got into sustainability in around 2008, and it's been interesting to see it come along in the last sort of 13-14 years, and it's obviously quite a no-brainer, but and I think it's becoming business as usual now. With all these legislative changes that are coming through, I think change is happening, and we need to make sure it happens as quickly as possible, because we don't have a infinite time frame to make these changes. But I think EVs have come a long way. Renewables have done the same, and we need to continue that and accelerate the pace. In terms of like managing supply chains, a lot of the inspectors and auditors that are in our network are small to medium-sized businesses. It might range from a one-man band to a one-woman band to a group of consultants that sometimes work together, and there might be 5 or 10 of them. And what we're excited about really is creating a global network of these experts, so that clients don't have to rely on the big sort of 4 or 5 consultancies that charge a huge amount and might not give you the best service unless you're one of their top few accounts. So providing these smaller businesses with access to market is really important to us, and hopefully it'll be the cornerstone of us building a successful business.
Yeah, awesome. I mean, we talk about sustainability, but let's talk about economical sustainability as well as ecological, because having a level playing field, not having an industry that's dominated by 5 big firms, that's real market sustainability, isn't it? And I'm up for anything that equalises the playing field within any industry, and letting those smaller guys compete on a global scale. It's really cool to see that you're really backing that.
Yeah, giving the small companies access to the technology that only the big ones can invest in, and without having to put the capital up front to build their own digital platform, and all the marketing for their services can be done through one central place through our website. And I think that aggregates a lot of spending power, and hopefully helps them compete. So it's going to be an exciting time.
Yeah, it sounds really exciting. And honestly, through all of the RegTech stuff that I've read about, that I've researched, that I've had on RegTech Talks over the past 2 years, I've never seen anything like your platform, particularly within supply chain. And I'm a big fan of supply chain. It absolutely fascinates me, global supply chain. So I'm sure if there was something like it, I would have seen it. So it's come to the end of our session, actually. So I just wanted to say a massive thank you to everyone who came on today. The whole session has been recorded, and that'll be going out on the RegTech Talks website along with a write-up of this event. Carl and Terry, thank you so much for your time, for your effort, and for your conversation with me, and indulging in some of my maybe a little bit just personal interest questions about what both of you do. I think that companies like yourselves, you really are at the forefront of just ensuring that our industries are able to remain compliant, but absolutely are within the scope of a sustainable change. So really appreciate your time today. If anyone does have any other questions for these guys, please you can send them over to us, and we can get you in touch with